So these are the agricultural revolutions. Let me give you one example. This is in North America. So for thousands of years, leading up to about 800 AD, people in the American Southwest lived in isolated settlements of a few families, very transient, very small. Then beginning around 800 years ago, over a 200-year period, a massive agricultural civilization explodes into the record. These are the famous Anasazi. We know about them. We can time travel back to see them because of the vast archaeological remains they've left. Let me just show you an example. This is the famous Pueblo Bonito ruin in the floor of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. It is a transcendental experience to walk this canyon. If you ever get the chance, do it. Let me give you a sense of the scale of the structure from which this is a residue. See that little piece of timber there that the Park Service has put up to keep that wall from standing up? Let's zoom in. So the little guy in the circle is me, my favorite scaling object, to give you a sense of how big this thing is. This thing had hundreds of rooms, could have accommodated thousands of people at one time. The canyon is full of structures of this sort. So over 200 years, you go from nothing to this. That happens over and over and over again, all across the planet, old world and new, with the onset of these agricultural revolutions. It's not just about plants and animals. It's about a fundamental change in human capability. And that change correlates with the scale of social cooperation. Okay, these are Neolithic settlements. So this is Anasazi stonework. Their masonry was extremely sophisticated. This is a famous Anasazi T-door, still in existence over 1,000 years after it was made. I'll wager this building will not be in existence 1,000 years from now. Their stone masonry was extraordinary. But again, overnight, all this expertise explodes into the record. All right, so these green circles represent Neolithic agricultural settlements. In this case, Mississippian settlements in the Midwest, a different agricultural civilization. Notice that each of them is dotted along the landscape. This blue line represents a river. What you see is that these Neolithic settlements exist. They're quite large, sometimes 5 to 10, maybe even 15,000 people, but they function as isolated units. They do not collaborate with one another. And in fact, these units exist for 5,000 years after the invention of agriculture. Then, about 5,000 years ago, something new happens. You start seeing massively enlarged units that we now call early states. So in other words, the fundamental unit of human cooperation goes from being a Neolithic agricultural village of maybe 10,000 people to a state of millions. And this happens, again, overnight. And the settlement distribution tells you that you've now set up a hierarchically organized set of settlements that are trading with one another. There are road systems in states that don't exist in Neolithic settlements. States, the first states, are a new scale of social cooperation. They do all kinds of remarkable things, as we'll see when we explore them later. Let me just remind you of one of them. Of course, one of the most famous for those of us in Western Europe and North America is the Roman Empire. Classic early state. These are the ruins of their architecture in present-day Rome. But in fact, states arose, just like agriculture, independently all around the globe. So I could have used the Inca in South America. I could have used the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. I could have used the in Chinese or the samurai in East Asia. There are many examples I could have used. They all share a whole set of common properties, including this massively enlarged scale of social cooperation. As you'll see, our theory predicts this. There's another sort of interesting detail here. These states invent a whole bunch of new things. What was one of them? Written language. So in fact, as our ancestors just a few centuries ago looked back into the past, what did they have? Did they have molecular biology and archaeology? They did not. What did they have? They had written history. What did they imagine? The human world began 5,000 years ago when these states first came into existence. As we'll see, history is a double-edged sword. It's the lie made up by the winner. But what matters to us right now is that the first history we knew before the birth of modern science was written by these people. It turns out that these societies, for reasons we'll see, are highly hierarchical, including slaves and serfs and peasants and nobles, and male-dominated. Small groups of elite males control all of these states everywhere in the world. So in fact, early biologists thought male-dominated hierarchy was the natural human condition, because that was all they knew. As we'll see, that's the utterest rubbish. In fact, democratized sexual equality is the 2-million-year-old human condition. This is a recent aberration. Very interesting, as you'll see. All right. If we use Rome as iconic for the early states, let's use New York as iconic for the modern state, the state you and I exist in. This is Times Square. I'm sure everyone in the room recognizes it. This is, I think, near Trump Plaza, or no, this is Columbus Circle, actually. Again, for the television audience, this is a local New York crowd, so we recognize these landmarks. And of course, this is Carnegie Hall, one of the great performance spaces in New York. So this city looks very different than Rome, even at its height. And it was very different. How confident are we that that's different? I'm going to finish by telling you that we're very confident. The modern state, let's call it, is another of these adaptive revolutions, just like the Neolithic or agricultural revolutions and the rise of the early state. This is another. Let me show you how confident we are that that's true. Let me use some very mundane data. Population and per capita GDP. Turns out that in England we have a lot of data of this form. So we can time travel back over the last few thousand years. Plotted along the bottom is GDP per capita, increasing left to right. On the vertical axis is population, increasing bottom to top. What do you notice? As population increases, people get poor. And as population decreases, people get richer. In fact, they're bouncing around in the famous Malthusian box. As population gets higher, increasingly marginal agricultural land is forced into cultivation, people get poorer. This went on, as I'll show you in a few minutes, for thousands of years in the context of the early state. That's about to change. Notice the dates here, before 1710. Let's crush this box down and change the scale. Why we have to change the scale will become apparent in a moment. So I'm going to take this same data, I'm just going to change the scale, so it's going to crush down. With me? Let's look at what happens after 1710. Boom. We explode out of the Malthusian box. Rules change. Population increases and wealth increases. Completely different trajectory overnight. This is an adaptive revolution. Let me show you this same data in a completely different kind of graphic display. So this is the last 5,000 years. I'm going to plot per capita GDP. No change, no change. Boom. That's the modern economic revolution. You and I are its beneficiaries. You and I are almost 100 times richer than a typical Englishman just 300 years ago. We're not just richer in the sense of dollars. Our command of the world is vastly greater. This, as we'll see, correlates with the democratization of the modern state, the elimination of this early state hierarchy, a return to the conventional human condition of democratized cooperation. But 2 million years ago, or 1 million years ago, we were doing that on the scale of a few hundred or a few thousand. We now do it on the scale of millions and billions. So the ancestral human trick works great, and it works even better when millions of people do it instead of thousands. That, we will argue, is the source of the modern economic miracle. This is not just about money. It's about everything else. This is the scientific revolution. So early states did cool science. The Islamic states, the Greek states, the Chinese states did cool science. But if you add up everything that we know, about 98% of it was learned in the last 400 years. So the scaling object here is the U, as a life insurance company would look at U, the actuarial U, to give you a sense of scale. Just a few U's back is Newton, Darwin. The modern scientific revolution is explosive, and it explodes into the record at just the same time as this modern economic miracle. They are all products of the same thing. We will argue products of democratization of the modern state. Playing the ancient human trick of democratized cooperation on a vastly larger new scale. We're going to argue to you, we will argue to you that that's the trajectory for the human future as well. As Instructor Sousa said at the outset, we're quite conscious that we often fail to control the conflict of interest problem. So this modern economic miracle and the overall trajectory does not change the fact that there are short-term setbacks. Let me show you a piece of data that you'll all be familiar with. This is the Dow Jones average from late 2007 to late 2008. It collapsed along nearly with the entire financial sector. This is me in Wall Street next to the famous bull down in lower Manhattan. Why did that happen? As we'll see, our theory tells us exactly why that happened. There are very specific ways in which we can fail to control the conflict of interest problem, and when we do, our social cooperation fails or dysfunctions. The cool part of this is that understanding how that works gives us the power to begin to control it. So this is Joanne and I standing at the UN Plaza in New York. I want to leave you with this image and make the following argument, that we're working toward both understanding how our social systems work better and how to globalize this social cooperation so that we're not cooperating now on the scale of 100 million people in the modern state, but on the scale of 6 billion people on planet Earth. The long-term potential for humane output, for economic wealth, for knowledge generation is colossal. Our great-grandchildren might look back on us, as we would hope them to, with pity at our poverty and ignorance because of what they are able to do. So there's very great reason, we'll argue on this theory, non-Pollyannish, hard-nosed reason to be hopeful about the human future.
We hope you'll enjoy taking this journey with us. Thank you.
Thank you.